There is a morning in the year 63 BCE that history almost forgot to record. It begins like 100 other mornings in Rome, with the sound of sandals on stone, with the low murmur of a city already awake and already scheming, with the smell of bread smoke and river water drifting up from the Tiber. A man named Quintus makes his way through the narrow streets before the sun has fully cleared the hills. He's not hurrying. He has no reason to hurry. He has been in this business long enough to know that urgency is a mask worn by the anxious. And Quintus is not anxious. He is certain. He has been certain for 3 months. The land distribution vote, the one the populares have been pushing, the one that would break up the great estates in the south and scatter them among veterans and the landless poor, is wrong. He believes this with the calm, immovable conviction of a man who has built his entire political identity on the sanctity of property and the wisdom of tradition. He has said so loudly and often in the forum, in letters to allies, in private conversations at dinner. There is no version of the morning that ends with him changing his position. He arrives at the private chamber just after the 2nd hour. The room belongs to a broker, one of those figures that Rome produces in abundance, men with no official title, an enormous informal influence, men who arrange meetings between other men and ask nothing for it, or so they claim. The chamber is smaller than Quintus expected. The walls are panelled in dark cedar wood. The light enters through a single high window, falling in a pale bar across the tiled floor. The air is different. It is not unpleasant. That is the first thing Quintus notices, and then, almost immediately, forgets. It is warm, heavy in a way that is not quite the warmth of a closed room. It carries something, amber, perhaps, and something else beneath that. Something he cannot name. Something that sits at the very edge of recognition and stays there. He breathes it without thinking. Everyone breathes without thinking. The meeting lasts perhaps 2 hours. There is wine, there is food, there is conversation that moves through the usual channels of Roman political negotiation. Obligation, precedent, the careful mapping of mutual interest. Quintus listens, he speaks, he hears himself speaking, and the words feel reasonable. They feel, in fact, more than reasonable. They feel inevitable. When the meeting ends, and he has agreed to withdraw his opposition to the land vote, he will signal this to his allies quietly. He will not make a spectacle of the reversal. He walks back through the streets, and the city smells the way it always does. Bread and animals and the sweet rot of the river. And somewhere between the chamber and his own doorstep, the certainty he carried in with him is simply gone. Not argued away, not negotiated away, gone. The way a dream goes when the morning light finds it. He does not think about the smell again. There is no reason to think about the smell. In Rome, in 63 BCE, every important room smells of something. That is what important rooms do. He doesn't know what happened to him. He never will. But the broker who arranged the meeting does. And the man who supplied the room's particular atmosphere knew exactly what he was doing. The question, the one that trails behind this quiet morning like smoke, is not what happened to Quintus. The question is how many other rooms smelled the same way, how many other men walked out of doors they had entered as one person and arrived home as another, and whether anyone, in 2,000 years of examining the record of Rome's most consequential decisions, has ever thought to ask about the air. Rome was a civilization that wrote things down. This is perhaps its most enduring gift to the world. Not its roads, not its law, not its architecture, but the sheer weight of its documentation. Rome recorded battles in exquisite tactical detail. It recorded the prices of grain and fish and sandals. It recorded the speeches of its senators, and the scandals of its emperors, the personal correspondence of its philosophers. Pliny the Elder wrote 37 volumes cataloguing the natural world. Cicero left behind hundreds of letters, so intimate they feel stolen. The jurist produced enough legal writing to fill a room. Rome did not forget things by accident. It forgot things when it forgot them, with purpose, and here is the silence that should give everyone pause. In all of that documentation, in the thousands of surviving texts, the papyrus archives of Roman Egypt, the stone inscriptions that line the roads of what was once the empire's nervous system, there is almost no direct mention of the deliberate use of aromatic compounds to alter the behavior of the people who inhaled them in political settings. Not a single law against the practice. Not a single prosecution specifically naming it. Not a single philosophical treatise addressing it as a concern. That silence is not neutral. It is shaped. When Rome wanted to suppress a practice, it generally did so in one of two ways. It prosecuted it loudly and publicly, creating a record of the thing's existence, even in the act of condemning it. Or it simply never named it, never gave it a word, never gave it a category, never gave it the formal recognition that would make it possible to debate, to legislate against, to remember. The underground perfume trade received the second treatment. It was, in the language of those who benefited from it most, a nameless thing. And nameless things do not survive in archives. What does survive, if one looks carefully, are the edges. Pliny the Elder, in his natural history, describes certain aromatic substances with a quality of unease that he never quite explains. He notes that some resins, burned in enclosed spaces, produce effects on the mind that go beyond mere pleasantness. And then he moves on, as though he has said too much and thought better of it. Suetonius, writing about Nero's famous dinner parties, lingers on descriptions of the room's atmosphere with an attention to detail that serves no obvious narrative purpose. Cicero, in a letter written in 59 BCE, mentions attending a political meeting in a private home and finding himself, as he puts it, unusually amenable to positions he had previously resisted, and attributes this to the quality of the host's wine. He does not mention the air. These are not random observations. They are the edges of something that the writers themselves could not fully name, pressing against the boundary of their awareness and failing to cross it. The knowledge existed. The practice existed. The trade that supplied it existed. What did not exist, what was carefully ensured not to exist, was the vocabulary to describe it in terms that would make it legible to authority or memory. This documentary is not built from the history that was written. It is built from the history that was deliberately left unwritten, from the gaps, the elisions, the sentences that start and do not finish, the footnotes that lead to rooms with no doors. The practice of reading history this way is not radical. Scholars of ancient medicine, ancient law, and ancient commerce have been doing it for decades. And what is unusual is a specific pattern they find when they look. A pattern so consistent, so precisely shaped around a particular kind of knowledge, that explaining it as coincidence requires more imagination than explaining it as intent. The record has a shape to its silence, and the shape is the story. Something was happening in the rooms of Rome, something that changed minds without argument and shifted decisions without pressure, something that left no trace in the official documents and every trace in the outcomes. The evidence is there for those who know where to look, not in what Rome chose to say, but in what it went to considerable trouble not to. Consider, for a moment, what perfume actually is, not what it represents, not luxury, not beauty, not the careful theatre of self-presentation, but what it is, physically, chemically, at the level of what enters the body when a person breathes. Perfume is a collection of volatile, organic compounds, suspended in air. They enter through the nose and travel within seconds to the olfactory bulb, a structure that sits at the base of the brain and connects, with almost no intermediary processing, directly to the limbic system. The limbic system governs emotion, memory, motivation, and fear. It is the oldest part of the brain. It does not pass its responses through the rational mind before acting on them. It simply acts. Every culture in human history has known, at some intuitive level, that smell moves people in ways that reason does not fully explain. The ancient Egyptians burned kifi, a compound of 16 ingredients, in their temples and their courts, and described its effects in terms that were partly religious and partly, if one reads carefully, cognitive. Clarity, agreeableness, the dissolution of resistance. The Persians maintained royal gardens specifically designed to produce ambient aromatic atmospheres during diplomatic meetings. The Mesopotamians had priestly traditions around scented smoke that outsiders consistently described as producing altered states in those who stood in its presence. None of these cultures called what they were doing chemistry, but they were doing chemistry. They simply called it something else. What if the same knowledge, older than Rome, sharper than Rome, refined across centuries of observation and careful experimentation, made its way into the city on the Tiber? What if the merchants and chemists and political operators who carried this knowledge understood precisely what they possessed and precisely how to use it? What if the Roman Republic and the Empire that followed it, two of the most sophisticated political structures the ancient world ever produced, were at key moments operating under a form of influence they had no language to describe and no mechanism to resist? These are not small questions. They are questions that, if taken seriously, change the color of 2 centuries of Roman political history. They change how one reads the Senate's sudden reversals, the emperor's erratic decisions, the strange pattern of agreements reached in private rooms that contradicted everything said in public the week before. They suggest that the story of Roman power is not only a story of military force and legal genius and brilliant oratory. It is also, quietly, invisibly, beneath all of that, a story about what was burning in the rooms where the real decisions were made. The trail is real. It runs across 3 continents, through trade records and chemical residues, and coded commercial documents, and the peculiar silences of historians who knew enough to be careful about what they said. It has been found, partially, by scholars working in isolation who could not see the full shape of what they had uncovered. What follows is an attempt to trace that trail from its beginning, from the laboratories of the ancient world, from the desert trade routes that Rome could not fully control, from the households where invisible knowledge was applied to very visible political ends, all the way to its final, quiet disappearance from the record. The most powerful empire in human history had a weakness, and that weakness, as his story will show, had a scent. In the year 2008, a team of researchers at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem published findings that caused a quiet stir in the fields of neuropharmacology and ancient history, though the two fields rarely share the same conferences, and the stir in each was largely invisible to the other. The researchers had been studying insensol acetate, a compound found in Boswellia resin, the tree whose hardened sap the ancient world called frankincense. What they found was this: when insensol acetate is absorbed into the bloodstream, it activates a protein receptor in the brain that regulates anxiety, mood, and the sensation of emotional warmth. In sufficient concentration, it produces a measurable increase in what researchers described as openness and social receptivity. In common language, it lowers the walls that separate one person's convictions from another person's influence. The ancient Egyptians already knew this. Not in the language of receptor proteins and biochemical pathways, they had other language, older language, the language of divine presence and sacred smoke, but they knew the effect with the precision of people who had been observing it for a very long time. The formula for Kifi, the ceremonial Egyptian aromatic compound, was inscribed on the walls of the temple at Edfu and the temple at Philae, and it specifies the inclusion of frankincense at a concentration considerably higher than would be necessary simply to produce a pleasant smell. It also specifies the conditions of use: enclosed spaces, repeated exposure over the course of several hours, a gathering of people in close proximity to the burning source. These are not the specifications of a perfumer seeking beauty. They are the specifications of someone who understands delivery. The Persians, working from a different botanical tradition, but arriving at the same conclusions by a different road, maintained what Greek observers described as scented chambers, rooms designed specifically for the reception of guests, in which aromatic resins were burned continuously throughout the duration of diplomatic meetings. The Greek historian Herodotus mentions these chambers in a tone of mild curiosity that suggests he found them pleasant without fully understanding their purpose. The Persian court understood their purpose with considerable clarity. Myrrh, the second great resin of the ancient world, works through a different mechanism. Its primary active compounds have a documented affinity for opioid receptors, the same receptors that respond to pain-relieving substances, producing, at low concentrations, a gentle sedation of the kind that makes prolonged sitting, extended conversation, and the gradual softening of firm opinions all feel natural and unremarkable. Combined with frankincense at specific ratios, the two resins produce a composite effect that ancient practitioners appear to have understood as a distinct state. Alert enough to engage in complex negotiation, relaxed enough to be moved by it. There are others. Oud, the resin produced by Aquilaria trees infected with a specific mold, found primarily in the forests of South and Southeast Asia, contains compounds that affect the central nervous system in ways that modern researchers are still mapping. Certain root-derived aromatic oils, extracted through processes that required both botanical knowledge and considerable chemical skill, produce effects on mood and cognition that vary with concentration in ways that make them simultaneously useful as perfume, as medicine, and as something harder to categorize. The ancient world did not have a category for this third thing, but it had the thing itself. What is significant across all of these traditions is not merely that these substances existed and that their effects were known. What is significant is that the knowledge of their effects was kept within specific communities. Priestly lineages, trade families, court specialists, who treated it not as common knowledge, but as a form of power. The chemistry was not mysterious to them. The mystery they maintained was deliberate. A carpenter does not hide how hammers work, but a locksmith, whose livelihood depends on controlling access to doors, might think very carefully about what knowledge to share and with whom. The ancient perfumer chemists, who understood the relationship between aromatic compounds and human cognition, were not carpenters. They were locksmiths, and the locks they managed opened doors that no army and no argument could open by any other means. Pliny the Elder was not an easy man to confuse. He was, by all accounts, one of the most systematically curious minds of the ancient world, a man who spent his life cataloguing everything he could see, touch, taste, or obtain a reliable account of, and who died, characteristically, in the pursuit of knowledge, sailing toward Vesuvius as it erupted in order to take better notes. When something confused Pliny, it is worth paying attention to the nature of his confusion. In his Natural History, Pliny describes a series of aromatic substances that he encountered in Rome, substances for which he could obtain no satisfactory account of origin. He names several of them with the careful hedging of a man who is not sure whether his information is accurate, and he notes that certain perfumers in Rome offered grades of aromatic material that did not correspond to anything in the established import taxonomy. He could not trace them to any known supplier. He could not find them listed in any official trade manifest. They simply existed in the hands of certain vendors at prices that suggested they were extraordinary, available to clients who did not advertise their purchases. This is not a minor observation. Rome's trade network in the 1st century CE was extensive and reasonably well documented, and there were official customs posts at the major ports. Alexandria, in particular, served as the great funnel through which Eastern goods passed into the Western Mediterranean. And there were tariff records, import registrations, and commercial agreements that tracked the movement of goods across the empire's borders with the thoroughness of an administrative apparatus that understood commerce as a form of revenue. For specific substances to be circulating in Rome with no documentation of their entry into the system is not impossible, but it requires explanation. The explanation that the evidence supports is straightforward in structure, if not in implication, and certain aromatic substances, particularly those with the most potent psychoactive properties, were being moved into Rome through channels that deliberately avoided the official import infrastructure. This was not simply tax evasion, though it had that dimension. It was the concealment of specific goods from the awareness of authorities who might ask what they were for. Archaeological chemistry has added a dimension to this picture that Pliny could not have possessed. The analysis of residues in ceramic vessels recovered from sites across the Roman world has revealed the presence of aromatic compounds that, by the known geography of their botanical sources, could only have originated in regions with which Rome did not have formal trade relationships during specific periods. Certain resin compounds found in 1st century CE vessels in Rome trace chemically to tree species found only in specific highland zones of the Arabian interior, zones that were, during the period in question, under the control of political entities that Rome regarded with hostility. Other compounds trace to South Asian botanical sources that official Roman trade accessed only indirectly through multiple layers of intermediary commerce, in forms that would have been far too diluted and far too expensive to explain their presence in the concentrations in which they appear in the archaeological record. Someone was moving these substances across hostile political borders, through custom systems designed to catch exactly this kind of movement, and delivering them to Rome in quantities sufficient to sustain a consistent trade. The substances should not have been there. The documentation of their presence is in the chemistry of what survived underground, in the ground undisturbed for 2,000 years. The documentation of their official absence is in every trade, manifest, and import record that does not mention them. This is what an underground trade looks like from the archaeological record. Not absence, but impossibility, the presence of things that the official record insists cannot be there, and the silence of the official record on the subject of how they arrived. In the ancient Egyptian institution known as the House of Life, the scriptoria and libraries attached to the great temples where knowledge was copied, preserved, and taught, there was a class of specialists whose title translates approximately as those who know the scent of the gods. This is not a poetic designation, it is a professional one. These were individuals who had undergone years of training in the identification, processing, and application of aromatic substances, who understood the chemistry of their materials in empirical, if not formal terms, and who occupied a position of considerable prestige within their institutional hierarchy. They were not perfumers in the decorative sense. They were specialists in what the compounds did and how to make them do it. The Zoroastrian firekeepers of Persia maintained a parallel tradition, organized around the maintenance of sacred flames and the management of the substances burned in them. The firekeeper who allowed the wrong compound into the sacred fire was not guilty of an aesthetic error. He was guilty of a professional failure with theological consequences, which is to say, with political consequences in a civilization where theology and politics were the same thing dressed differently. The knowledge of which substances produced which effects, in which concentrations, under which conditions, was knowledge held collectively by a priestly caste and transmitted through initiation rather than publication. Herodotus describes the aromata merchants of the Arabian Peninsula as a distinct class of traders who dealt in substances so valuable that they maintained private armed escorts and did not discuss the sources of their goods with anyone outside their own commercial networks. He notes, with the particularity of a man who has tried to find out and failed that the interior geography of the Arabian incense-producing regions was a matter of active concealment on the part of those who worked there, that merchants told elaborate stories about dragons and giant birds guarding the source trees, stories that Herodotus himself found too convenient to believe, designed specifically to discourage investigation. This is the world from which the underground perfume trade drew its most significant practitioners. Not common merchants, not decorative artisans, but inheritors of traditions that understood aromatic compounds as instruments of precise effect. Traditions that had been refining that understanding across centuries before Rome existed as a city. When these traditions encountered Rome, its wealth, its political volatility, its enormous market for luxury goods, its almost complete absence of any indigenous aromatic expertise of equivalent sophistication, the encounter was not between equals. It was between a civilization that knew something and a civilization that did not know it was being studied. The most skilled practitioners who made their way into Rome's orbit were not the visible perfumers who maintained public shops in the city's commercial districts. They were the ones who operated behind the shops, who appeared in the records of certain households as suppliers of unnamed luxury goods, who maintained relationships with specific clients over decades through intermediaries who themselves had no direct knowledge of what they were facilitating. They left almost no record of themselves as individuals. What they left was their work, the pattern of changed minds, altered decisions, and political outcomes that should not, by the logic of the visible record, have occurred as they did. The invisible hand is a metaphor that gets borrowed frequently by people who want to describe forces that shape events without appearing in them. In Rome, in the late Republic and early Empire, there was an invisible hand. It smelled of amber and cedar and something deeper, something that had no name in Latin, something that travelled across deserts and hostile borders to reach the rooms where the most consequential decisions of the ancient world were made. And it belonged to people whose names history, in its infinite deliberateness, forgot to write down. There is a version of ancient trade history that is taught in schools and repeated in popular books, and it goes roughly like this. Rome stood at the center of a vast commercial network, its roads radiating outward like spokes on a wheel, its ports processing the goods of the known world, its administrative apparatus regulating commerce from Britain to the borders of Persia. In this version, Rome is the hub. Everything passes through it. Everything is, to some degree, visible to it. This version is not false. It is simply incomplete in a way that happens to matter enormously for the story being traced here. The Nabatean kingdom, centered at the extraordinary rock city of Petra, in what is now southern Jordan, controlled the land routes through which Arabian aromatics travelled northward toward the Mediterranean for several centuries before Rome absorbed the territory in 106 CE. The Nabateans were not subjects of Rome during this period. They were not clients of Rome. They were independent operators who had built their entire civilization on the control of a single commercial corridor, and they guarded that control with the sophisticated paranoia of people who understood that their survival depended on being the indispensable link between the producers of luxury goods and the consumers who wanted them. They maintained relationships with suppliers in Arabia, in East Africa, and through intermediaries in South Asia. They set prices, they controlled access, they decided who could move what through their territory and at what cost. But the Nabateans were only the most visible layer of an alternate trade infrastructure that ran alongside Rome's official networks at every point where the official networks had gaps. So the Aksumite merchants of highland East Africa controlled the sea routes across the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean. The Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival to the east, a political entity that Rome spent enormous resources attempting to manage and never fully succeeded, controlled the overland corridors across which Central Asian goods moved westward. Between these three powers, the Nabateans on the land, the Aksumites on the sea, the Parthians on the eastern steppe, there existed a commercial infrastructure of extraordinary reach and sophistication that operated on social contracts, on family relationships, on religious affiliations, and on the kind of multi-generational trust that cannot be replicated by any administrative system, however efficient. This alternate infrastructure did not go around Rome. It went beneath it, through the gaps in its administrative attention, through the jurisdictions where Roman authority existed on paper but not in practice, through the relationships between foreign merchants and Roman intermediaries who had every incentive to facilitate commerce and no particular incentive to ensure it was officially documented. The substances that moved through this infrastructure were ideal for it. High value, low volume, easily concealed within ordinary commercial shipments, and not recognizable to customs officials who had no training in botanical chemistry. Rome knew, in a general way, that its control of Eastern trade was imperfect. Its officials complained about it. Its emperors legislated against it. Pliny himself, writing about the drain of Roman gold to the east in exchange for luxury goods, he estimated the annual outflow at 100 million sesterces, a figure that represents a trade volume vastly larger than what the official records could account for. He attributed the discrepancy to the luxury goods trade in general. The specific category of aromatic compounds with political applications is not one he was positioned to identify within that discrepancy, but the discrepancy itself is there, in his own writing, large enough to contain it. In the archive known as the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a 1st century CE Greek merchant's guide to the trade routes of the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, there is a category of trader described with notable vagueness. These are not the large-scale merchants who move bulk goods between major ports. They are smaller operators, described as moving between ports on irregular schedules, trading in what the text calls unspecified aromatics and goods of unknown classification. The vagueness is deliberate on the part of the text's author, who is describing a category of commerce that he apparently understands but has reasons not to detail. They appear in the record as a type without names, a practice without description, a trade without documentation. The commercial correspondence preserved among the Oxyrhynchus papyri, a vast collection of documents recovered from a site in Roman Egypt, contains a subset of merchant letters in which the language of transaction becomes, at certain points, unusually elliptical. Historians who have studied these letters Note that they follow a consistent pattern. Ordinary, commercial language for ordinary goods. And then, at specific moments, a shift into terminology that does not match any known commercial classification. Phrases used to describe certain consignments are functional rather than descriptive. They say what the goods accomplish rather than what they are. This is not the language of a merchant who does not know what he is selling. It is the language of a merchant who knows precisely what he is selling and has decided not to put that knowledge in writing. The physical profile of the underground aromatic trade was ideal for concealment. The most potent compounds were not bulky. A ceramic vessel the size of a wine jug could contain a quantity of concentrated resin sufficient to scent a large room at effective concentrations for months. A chest of such vessels, hidden within a larger shipment of ordinary goods, would be invisible to a customs inspector who did not know what he was looking for and had no reason to look. The outer goods, lower-grade aromatics, textiles, spices of the ordinary kind, served as both cover and legitimate commerce. The men who moved these shipments were not smugglers in the dramatic sense. They were merchants with complex inventories, some of which they preferred not to itemize. What allowed the network to persist for as long as it did was not the invisibility of its goods. It was the invisibility of its relationships. The critical link between the external supply chain and Rome's interior was the freedman, the formerly enslaved person who had been granted freedom by a wealthy Roman household and typically remained within that household's orbit as a trusted agent. Freedmen managed their former master's commercial affairs, maintained relationships with suppliers, and handled the day-to-day logistics of household procurement. They were simultaneously inside the domestic space of the Roman elite and connected to the commercial world outside it. For anyone seeking to move specialized goods into the hands of wealthy Roman clients without creating an official paper trail, the freedman was the ideal intermediary. He was trusted. He was mobile. He was part of the household without being subject to its oversight in the way that slaves were, and he had every incentive to be discreet about the arrangements from which he derived his living. This was not a network of strangers. It was a network of relationships, maintained across generations, in which everyone involved understood the value of what they were facilitating and the necessity of ensuring that its value stayed secret. In the natural history, Pliny the Elder records the price of the finest grade of nard, the aromatic oil extracted from the spikenard plant of the Himalayan foothills, at 300 denarii per pound. A Roman legionary soldier earned, at the time of writing, approximately 900 denarii per year. 1 pound of fine nard cost him 4 months of his life in earnings. A single ceramic vessel, of the kind used for high-grade aromatic storage, might hold 3 to 5 pounds. The mathematics of this are not ambiguous. Nobody pays the equivalent of an annual income for something whose only function is to make a room smell pleasant. The logic of commerce does not support it. The logic of comfort does not support it. The logic of social display, the Roman impulse to demonstrate wealth through conspicuous consumption, supports expensive goods, but not at this scale of expense, for something that evaporates into the air within hours. There is only one logic that makes these prices rational. and it is the logic of utility. Specific people were paying these prices because the substances they were buying were worth the price in terms of what they accomplished. The pricing structure of the underground trade was not simply a reflection of rarity, though rarity was part of it. It was more precisely a reflection of access control. The most potent formulations, the ones that produce the most reliable and the most precisely calibrated cognitive effects, were available only from practitioners who understood what they were producing and who chose their clients with care. The price was high, partly because the ingredients were difficult to source, and partly because the knowledge required to combine them effectively was itself a resource that had been accumulated over generations and was not freely shared. The seller was not merely selling a substance, he was selling the accumulated expertise of a tradition that had no parallel in the Roman world. What makes the pricing record speak most directly to the underground trade's political application is the evidence of differentiation. In surviving commercial correspondence, so there are references to what appears to be a standard grade and a specialist grade of certain aromatic compounds, with the specialist grade commanding prices that are not merely higher, but categorically higher, by multiples rather than margins. One document from Roman Egypt, dated to approximately the mid-1st century CE, contains what appears to be a commercial dispute, in which one party complains that he was supplied with the ordinary kind when he had paid for what the document calls, in Greek, to ischeron, the strong kind. The dispute is framed as a commercial grievance, but the distinction the document describes between an ordinary aromatic product and a stronger, more expensive, the more specifically potent version of the same category of good, is precisely the distinction that the political application of these substances would require. The strong kind. The words sit in a commercial dispute from 2,000 years ago, unexplained, unremarked upon in the document itself, and they describe a category of product that the buyer clearly understood, that the seller clearly understood, and that both parties treated as something different in kind from the ordinary aromatic goods that surrounded it in the marketplace, different in kind, different in price, different in what it did to a room and the people inside it. The strong kind was the point. Everything else was the cover story. Rome had a social custom that made the underground perfume trade's most sensitive operation almost trivially easy to execute. It was not a dark custom, not a secret practice, not a vulnerability that required exposure. It was simply this: in Roman elite society, a house that did not smell beautiful was a house that announced its owner's poverty or lack of taste. From the earliest period of the Republic's upper class to the most extravagant years of the empire, the aromatic management of domestic space was a marker of social standing as legible and as deliberate as the quality of one's toga or the number of one's clients. The domus, the private home of a wealthy Roman, was scented continuously. Aromatic substances burned in oil lamps and in dedicated braziers. Specific rooms had specific scents, chosen to complement their function. The triclinium, the dining room where guests were received and political conversations happened over long meals, typically carried the heaviest, warmest aromatic signature. The atrium, the central reception space, was scented to create a first impression. The private chambers where the most sensitive conversations occurred, were maintained with particular attention. All of this was managed by members of the household, often by the freedmen and women who handled domestic procurement and who maintained relationships with perfumers and aromatic suppliers in the city's commercial districts. This domestic infrastructure was the delivery mechanism for the underground trade's most significant political applications. It was not dramatic. There was no secret compartment, no hidden hand administering a substance to an unwilling target. It worked through the absolute normalcy of the practice it inhabited. A household's aromatic supplier, the person who provided the oils and resins and compounds that burned in every room, could, if he were the right kind of supplier with the right kind of knowledge, provide compounds that accomplished considerably more than the creation of an agreeable atmosphere. The household's inhabitants would notice no difference. The guests would notice no difference. The scent was there. The scent was always there. That was the entire point. The pathway through which this worked in practice moves through the figure of Lucius Licinius Crassus, the great Roman orator widely regarded as the finest advocate of his generation, a man whose private dining room became in the years of his most significant political influence what ancient sources describe with unusual consistency as a space of remarkable agreeableness. Guests who entered that room in disagreement with their host frequently left in agreement. This was attributed universally and without apparent irony to the quality of Crassus's conversation and the excellence of his hospitality. One source mentions, in passing, that the room's aromatic atmosphere was maintained by a supplier whose identity was unknown to Crassus himself, that the management of household aromatics was the province of his household staff, as was the case in every Roman home of equivalent standing, and that Crassus no more knew the provenance or specific composition of what burned in his dining room than he knew the origin of the olive oil in his lamps. He didn't need to know. Nobody needed to know. The knowledge lived entirely within the supply chain, from the specialist who produced the compound to the freedmen who purchased it, to the lamp in which it burned. The host was the vehicle and the cover simultaneously. His genuine hospitality, his genuine skill in conversation, his genuine reputation for producing evenings of unusual political harmony, all of these were real. They were also, in the most precise sense possible, being assisted. In 67 BCE, a land distribution bill moved through the Roman Senate that its sponsors had spent months carefully building support for, and its opponents had spent the same months building resistance to. The vote was expected to be close. The bill was not expected to pass. The coalition against it was solid. Experienced men, and men whose opposition was not a matter of political positioning, but of deep conviction. Men who had made their careers on the principle that agricultural land in Italy was the foundation of Roman stability and was not to be redistributed regardless of the pressure applied by Rome's growing landless classes and its increasingly restive veteran population. Then a private dinner was held, hosted by a political broker whose name appears in the historical record once, in a single, incidental reference, and then disappears entirely. 8 senators attended. The dinner lasted until the second watch of the night. The house, according to a letter written by one of the guests to a friend in the days that followed, was warm with what he described as Eastern perfumes, heavy, pleasant, the kind that make long evenings feel shorter. 4 of the 8 senators who attended that dinner subsequently reversed their opposition to the land bill. The bill passed by a margin of 6 votes. These are facts recoverable from the historical record. The dinner is documented. The attendance is partially documented. The aromatic atmosphere is mentioned incidentally in private correspondence. The subsequent reversals are documented in the Senate's own records. What is not documented, what was never put into writing by anyone at any point in the chain of events, is the connection between the atmosphere of the dinner and the decisions made by the men who breathed it. Because in Rome, in 67 BCE, no one had a language for that connection. It was not a thing that could be named. The second case sits 3 years later, in 64 BCE. A man accused of embezzlement, a case that, and by the preponderance of the evidence presented, should have resulted in conviction, was acquitted by a jury of 32. The jury did not deliberate in the forum. They deliberated in a borrowed private chamber in the house of a Roman equestrian whose household aromatics were supplied by a freedman with documented commercial relationships with Nabatean merchants. One juror, in a conversation with his physician some years later, that was recorded by the physician in a personal notebook later discovered among the Herculaneum papyri, described his experience of the deliberations as unusual. He had entered the chamber certain of his verdict. He found himself, over the course of several hours in the room, unable to maintain the clarity of his earlier judgment. The certainty dissolved, he said, without being replaced by any counter-argument. I simply went. The third case is the most delicate because it involves a military appointment made in the early years of the empire that bypassed 3 more senior candidates without explanation. Tacitus mentions it in the Annals with uncharacteristic brevity. A single sentence, no reasoning provided, no context offered for a decision that his contemporary readers would have found remarkable. The appointment was made following a private meeting between the emperor's chief household advisor and the successful candidate's patron. The meeting took place in the advisor's private office, a room that appears in other contexts in the historical record, associated with the same category of supplier who features in the 2 earlier cases. 3 instances, 3 different decades, 3 different types of political outcome, and the same pattern beneath them. A private room, a specific atmosphere, a decision that contradicts the expected logic of the political situation. The pattern does not prove causation. It does something, in some ways, more difficult to dismiss. It proves consistency. And consistency in the study of human behavior across time is never meaningless. Rome had laws against bribery. It had an entire legal category, ambitus, specifically addressing the corruption of votes and decisions through material inducement. The penalties for ambitus were severe: exile, the loss of the right to hold office, financial penalties that could destroy a family's standing for generations. Rome took the corruption of its political process seriously as a matter of law, prosecuted it regularly, and built a significant portion of its reputation for civic virtue on the claim that its deliberative processes were, in principle, resistant to manipulation. None of those laws addressed what was being done with fragrance. Not because the lawmakers were ignorant. Many of the men who wrote and debated Rome's corruption laws were the same men who attended the dinners and sat in the chambers where aromatic manipulation was occurring. But because Ambitus is a law about money, it is a law about the exchange of material goods for political compliance. It has a specific mechanism it can identify, a transaction it can locate, a moment of corruption it can prove. The thing being done with aromatic compounds had none of those features. There was no transaction, there was no agreement. There was no corruption that any system of law then existing, or for that matter, now existing, could identify as such. A man who breathes air in a room is not being bribed. A host who burns substances in his dining room is not making an illegal offer. The mechanism was not a crime. It was not even, in any vocabulary available to the ancient world, a category. This is what made it, from the perspective of those who operated the trade, not merely useful, but ideal. Every other form of the political corruption in Rome left residue. Money changed hands, and money could be traced. Threats were made, and threats had witnesses. Promises were given, and promises, when broken or kept, entered the record in the form of outcomes that required explanation. The fragrance mechanism left nothing. The meeting occurred, the atmosphere occurred, so the scent dispersed into the air and took in its evidence with it. The decisions that followed existed only in the official record, where they appeared as the ordinary products of the deliberative process, surprising, perhaps, in specific cases, but not provably the result of anything other than persuasion and the natural evolution of political judgment. This was not an accident of the practice's early development. The evidence suggests it was a design principle. The people who understood what these compounds could do also understood with considerable clarity that the value of their knowledge depended entirely on its invisibility. A known weapon is a weapon that can be defended against. Sire, the moment this practice had a name, the moment it entered the official vocabulary of Roman political life as a category of manipulation, it would become something that could be prohibited, prosecuted, and guarded against. It would lose its entire advantage. The maintenance of its namelessness was not a secondary concern of the underground perfume trade. It was the trade's primary strategic commitment. Rome's republic, in its final century, was a civilization under pressure from every direction, from the ambitions of its generals, from the resentments of its lower classes, from the endless friction of its competing elite factions. All of those forces have been studied, debated, and documented for 2,000 years. The one force that has remained until recently, almost entirely outside that scholarly conversation, is the invisible one, the one that operated not in the forum, but in the rooms behind the forum, not through argument, but through atmosphere, not by changing what men thought, but by making them feel, in specific rooms on specific evenings, that what they were about to agree to was something they had always, in some part of themselves, already believed. Descend in imagination from the marble and the rhetoric. Leave the forum behind, leave the Senate House, leave the porticos where the philosophers walk and the advocates prepare their arguments. Move south toward the Tiber, where the air thickens with the smell of the river and the docks and the accumulated commerce of a city that consumes more than any other city on earth. Here the streets narrow, the buildings press together, and the sounds are different, not the formal cadences of political Latin, but the mixed tongues of the port, the Greek and Aramaic and Nabatean, and the half-dozen other languages of people who have come to Rome to trade and have no particular interest in assimilating. This is the other city. It has always been here, beneath the official one, more durable in certain ways, less legible to history in almost all of them. The perfume trade's public face was here. Perfumers maintained shops in the commercial districts of the Subura, and along the roads leading to the larger forum markets, small establishments, usually family operations, offering the standard range of aromatic goods that every Roman household of any means purchased regularly. These were legitimate businesses. They paid their taxes, registered their operations. They maintained commercial relationships with suppliers who appeared in the appropriate trade manifests. They were, in the terms of the Roman commercial world, ordinary. Behind them, not metaphorically, but sometimes literally, in back rooms separated from the public shop by a door that was always locked from the inside, was a different kind of operation. The same building that processed ordinary aromatic goods for ordinary clients also maintained, for a separate clientele reached exclusively through private referral, a range of goods that never appeared in the front of the shop and whose existence would not be confirmed by the proprietor to anyone who had not arrived through the correct channels with the correct introduction. The Roman world was full of such arrangements. Physicians who maintained one set of remedies for common patients and another for those who knew to ask for something stronger. Moneylenders who offered standard rates publicly and private arrangements to select clients. The architecture of the double business was not unique to the aromatic trade, but the aromatic trade had taken it to a level of sophistication that most double businesses never reached, because the aromatic trade had something most double businesses did not. A product whose most important quality was that it left no trace of itself after use. The clients who accessed the inner operation were not identified by name in any record that has survived. They were identified to the proprietors who served them, by relationships, by who had vouched for them, by which established client had made the introduction, by the chain of social trust that constituted the network's membership system. Entry was not purchased. It was earned through existing relationships, and it could be revoked in the same way. The network was, in structural terms, a guild without a name, a community without a meeting place, a profession without a title. Its membership was distributed across the social fabric of Rome in a way that made it invisible to any observer who was not already inside it. The commercial documents of the ancient world are not, in general, subtle. A merchant selling grain records the grain, its quantity, its quality, its price, the names of the buyer and seller, the date and location of the transaction. Commercial language is, by nature, precise and explicit. It has to be, because commercial disputes are resolved by reference to the documents, and ambiguity in those documents is a liability. When commercial documents become suddenly vague or adopt terminology that does not correspond to any standard classification, the vagueness is not an accident. It is a choice. Among the several thousand commercial papyrus documents recovered from Egyptian sites across the 19th and 20th centuries, there is a subset, small in number but consistent in character, in which the description of aromatic goods shifts from the standard terminology of the aromatic trade into language that is functional rather than botanical. The substances are described not by their source plant or their method of preparation, but by what they accomplish. Phrases appear in Greek that translate approximately as the calming kind, the kind for meetings, the kind that opens the chest, the evening persuader. These are not descriptions of scent, they are descriptions of effect. They identify their subject matter not by what it is, but by what it does to the people who encounter it. Its functional vocabulary is not random. It appears across documents from different centuries, different geographic locations within Egypt, and different trading networks, suggesting not a local improvisation, but a shared commercial language, a terminology that had become standardized within the trade precisely because it allowed buyers and sellers to communicate about what they were actually purchasing without putting that information into words that an outside observer could read and understand. The buyer who asked for the evening persuader was not confused about what he was buying. The seller who supplied it was not confused about what he was selling. The language was not euphemism in the sense of evasion. It was a technical vocabulary that had developed within a closed professional community and that functioned perfectly well for those inside the community precisely because it was opaque to those outside it. The ledger practices of the underground trade's most sophisticated operators added another layer of concealment. There are surviving commercial accounts from Roman Egypt in which the same transaction appears twice, once in a standard form that would satisfy any administrative inspection, and once in a secondary notation whose meaning becomes clear only in the context of the other documents in the same archive. In these secondary notations, the true value of certain transactions is recorded in terms that confirm what the coded language of the invoices suggests, that a portion of every aromatic shipment was categorically different from the rest, that this different portion commanded prices that were entirely out of proportion with the declared value of the goods, and that the parties to these transactions understood and accepted this discrepancy as normal. The ledgers were, in effect, double, not in the fraudulent accounting sense, but in the sense of maintaining two simultaneous narratives about the same commercial reality, one for the record and one for the truth. There is a structural logic to what the evidence reveals about the domestic dimension of the underground perfume trade, and it is a logic that should feel, in retrospect, almost obvious. In Roman society, in the management of a household's domestic environment, including its aromatic supplies, its decorative choices, the selection of suppliers for goods that were consumed rather than displayed, was, with very few exceptions, the responsibility of the women of the household. Elite Roman women were the principal buyers of aromatic goods. They were the ones who maintained relationships with perfumers. They were the ones who decided what burned in which rooms, at what times, under what circumstances. This gave them something that no male political operator in Rome could possess through any amount of wealth or influence, legitimate unremarkable, completely expected access to the aromatic environment of every important domestic space. In a senator seeking to ensure that a particular fragrance was present in a particular room for a particular meeting would have needed to arrange this through a chain of intermediaries, each of whom represented a potential security failure. A woman of the household simply made the purchase decision and relayed it to the household staff. No chain of intermediaries, no traceable arrangement. The decision was so embedded in the ordinary management of domestic life that it generated no record and attracted no attention. 3 figures emerge from the historical record with profiles that suggest more than passive participation in the domestic aromatic environment. The first is a woman identified in several papyrus documents from the late Republic period only by her cognomen, a common naming practice for women of the period, who appears in commercial records as a regular purchaser of high-grade aromatic compounds from suppliers with documented Nabatean connections, and whose household was, for a period of approximately 15 years, the regular venue for political meetings at which several significant reversals in Roman senatorial positions occurred. Her name appears in no political history. Her commercial purchases appear in the trade records. The connection between the two is not documented anywhere in the ancient world. It is visible only when the 2 sets of records are placed alongside each other and the dates are compared. The second figure is a Roman matron of the Julio-Claudian period whose social network overlapped to a degree that was unusual even for the highly interconnected world of Roman elite society, with both the household of a known freedman supplier and the private social circles of 3 senators whose political positions shifted in directions favorable to the ruling family during a period of acute succession uncertainty. The third is a woman mentioned in Tacitus, not in connection with aromatic matters, but in connection with a political trial, mentioned and then, in the very next sentence, dropped, in a way that suggests Tacitus knew more than he was recording. These women were not villains in any simple sense, and they were politically intelligent actors, operating in a social world that offered them almost no official channels of power and a very specific set of unofficial ones. The domestic aromatic environment was one of those channels. They used it, and the record of their using it is there, fragmented but present, for those who know what combination of documents to read together. In the administrative records of the city of Rome, there is a gap in the aediles files from the early 1st century CE, a gap of approximately 4 months, during which the records of a specific investigation simply stop. What preceded the gap has been partially reconstructed from cross-referencing documents. Complaints had been received about the commercial practices of several perfumers operating near the Tiber's commercial district, and the nature of the complaints is unclear in the surviving material. The initial report appears to have been either lost or removed, but the response is clear enough. A formal investigation was opened. Inspections were conducted. Several containers of unclassified aromatic material were confiscated from at least one establishment. At least 3 foreign merchants who were present in Rome at the time were detained for questioning, and then the investigation stops. Not concluded, stopped. There is no record of a trial. There is no record of the confiscated materials being catalogued or tested or returned. There is no record of the detained merchants being charged with anything or formally released through any documented process. The investigation simply ceases to appear in the records mid-progress, with no notation of why. The absence of an explanation is itself the most important element of the record. Roman administrative process, for all its complexity and occasional corruption, was thorough about its documentation of formal closures. Investigations were either concluded with a result, a prosecution, an acquittal, a formal dismissal of charges, or they were superseded by some higher authority, in which case the supersession was typically documented. An investigation that vanishes from the record without any of these formal markers is an investigation that was ended informally through means that the parties involved preferred not to have documented. What this suggests, within the context of everything the preceding chapters have established about the network structure, is that by the early imperial period, the underground perfume trade had cultivated sufficient connections within Rome's administrative and political apparatus to protect itself from investigations that penetrated too close to its core operations. This is not a claim that requires dramatic conspiracy. It requires only that the network included, among its clients or its protectors, individuals with enough institutional standing to make a quiet request to the right person at the right level of the administrative hierarchy. The investigation stopped because someone decided it should stop. The decision left no record because leaving a record of it would have constituted precisely the kind of evidence that the investigation had been trying to gather. The network was not invulnerable. It was simply better connected than the systems designed to constrain it. That is a different kind of security, more durable, more adaptive, and in the long run, more difficult to dismantle. The conventional account of Caesar Germanicus, who took the throne at 24 and is remembered by the nickname his father's soldiers gave him as a child, Caligula, Little Boots, is a story of corruption by power. He arrived sane and was made mad by the absolute authority that descended upon him when Tiberius died in 37 CE. The senators, who had suffered under Tiberius's paranoid reign, welcomed Caligula with extraordinary enthusiasm, and he appeared in the first months of his rule to justify that enthusiasm. He was generous, he was publicly gracious, he released political prisoners, burned the files of the secret intelligence apparatus, promised a return to the collaborative governance of the Republic's traditions. And then something changed. Within a year, sometimes cited as the consequence of a serious illness he suffered in late 37 CE, the Caligula of history's nightmare began to emerge. The cruelties are documented extensively and with the relish of writers who had every reason to make the contrast with his early reign as stark as possible. What is less often examined is the specific context of his behavioral deterioration, the environment in which it occurred, the people who surrounded him most closely during the period of the most extreme incidents, and the material conditions of his daily life in the enclosed spaces of the Palatine Palace complex. Suetonius describes Caligula's personal habits with an attention to sensory detail that is unusual even for Suetonius, who was not generally restrained in such matters. The emperor's private chambers, he notes, were maintained with extraordinary aromatic richness. oil lamps burning constantly, braziers of resins from the east, the air described by Suetonius as heavy and warm in a way that visitors found either pleasant or disorienting, depending on the length of their exposure. The same household freedmen who managed the Palatine's aromatic environment appear in administrative records from the period, in commercial contact with suppliers whose networks trace back through the established channels of the underground aromatic trade. This is not a claim that Caligula's mental instability was caused by aromatic compounds. His illness in 37 CE, his apparent neurological or psychological deterioration, the pressure of absolute power in a young man with no preparation for it, all of these factors exist in the historical record and require no supplement. What the aromatic context adds is not a cause but a complication. The possibility that whatever predispositions or vulnerabilities Caligula carried into his reign were being amplified at specific moments by a chemical environment that neither he nor the people around him had any framework to identify or evaluate. A man on the edge of a cliff does not need a push to fall, but a push changes the specific timing of the fall. And timing, in politics, is everything. The pattern of his most extreme decisions clusters when mapped against the evidence of his schedule and the records of where he spent his time, around periods of extended time in his private chambers. That may mean nothing. It may mean something. The record does not resolve the question. It only makes it harder to set aside. Nero is a more complicated case than Caligula, and in certain ways a more disturbing one, because the evidence suggests a relationship with aromatic compounds that was not passive but deliberate. Where Caligula appears in the record as a potential victim, a man whose environment may have shaped him in ways he didn't choose, Nero appears as something closer to a practitioner, a ruler who understood, or whose advisors understood on his behalf, that the management of a room's atmosphere was a form of power. The Domus Aurea, the Golden House, Nero's extraordinary palace complex, and built after the Great Fire of 64 CE on land that its construction cleared in the heart of Rome, was not simply a monument to imperial excess, though it was certainly that. It was, architecturally, a machine for the management of experience. Its rotating dining room ceiling, its mechanical systems for releasing flower petals onto diners, its pipes designed to distribute perfumed mists through the banquet spaces. These were not decorative novelties. They were delivery systems. They were infrastructure for the precise management of what was breathed by specific people in specific rooms at specific times. The men who dined in the Domus Aurea during Nero's reign include, in the historical record, a remarkable proportion of senators and public figures who emerged from those dinners having moderated positions they had previously held firmly. And this is noted in the ancient sources with the kind of oblique admiration that political observers reserve for genuinely effective operators, as though Nero's powers of persuasion at dinner were simply unusually good, his hosting somehow superior to that of other rulers, his social intelligence remarkable. None of the ancient sources ask about the heir, the freedman Epaphroditus, one of Nero's most trusted household officials, the man who managed the practical affairs of the imperial domestic establishment. Appears in commercial records with connections to aromatic suppliers that are, given his position and the period, notable. He was not a perfumer. His recorded responsibilities were administrative, but the management of what burned in the domus aureas, dinner spaces, fell within the domain of exactly the kind of household official he was, and the records that document his commercial relationships suggest that he was not purchasing ordinary grade materials for those spaces. The domus aurea was destroyed after Nero's death, deliberately and thoroughly, its contents stripped and its spaces filled with rubble to serve as the foundation of Trajan's baths. The physical evidence that might have confirmed the specific nature of its aromatic environment is gone. What remains is the pattern of its political outcomes, the architecture of its delivery systems, and the commercial connections of the man who managed what burned inside it. Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations for himself. This is the first thing to understand about the book, that it was not composed for publication, not intended as a philosophical treatise for posterity, but as a set of private reminders written by a man who found the maintenance of his own clarity genuinely difficult. He was reminding himself, repeatedly and with evident urgency, to hold on to something that the circumstances of his life were working constantly to dissolve. In several passages, Marcus describes his deliberative process in terms that are, on close reading, unusual. He writes of the necessity of stepping back from the immediate sensory environment of a decision, of allowing what he calls the first impression to pass before acting on it, of maintaining a distance between what a situation feels like and what it actually is. These are Stoic principles, and Marcus was a deeply committed Stoic. So their presence in the Meditations is not, in itself, remarkable. What is slightly remarkable is the specific language he uses when describing the states he is trying to resist. He writes of a pleasant fog that descends in certain environments. He writes of the dissolution of conviction that feels, while it is happening, like the natural arrival of better judgment. He writes of the necessity of removing himself from places that feel agreeable, which is, in Stoic terms, a warning sign rather than a virtue. The practice of holding certain deliberations, outdoors, documented in the accounts of Marcus's reign and attributed by his contemporaries to the medical advice of his physician Galen, who recommended fresh air for the emperor's chronic respiratory complaints, takes on a different quality in this context. Galen's prescription was genuine. Marcus's respiratory health was genuinely poor, but the coincidence of this practice with the specific pattern of environments that Marcus's own writing suggests he found cognitively problematic is difficult to dismiss entirely. Marcus held meetings outdoors. He processed decisions in open air when the subject matter was particularly consequential. He maintained, with a consistency that went beyond what his medical situation strictly required, a practice of deliberating in conditions where the management of the ambient atmosphere was not possible. Whether this was a conscious, strategic choice or the expression of an instinct that his philosophical training had sharpened into practice, and the record does not say, what it does show is an emperor who produced a reign of unusual deliberative consistency, whose decisions, unlike those of almost every predecessor, tracked closely with his publicly stated positions, operating in conditions that were precisely the opposite of those in which the underground trade's most significant political effects had been demonstrated. He may have known he may only have felt it. The difference, for the purposes of the historical record, is irrelevant. The outcome is the same: 3 emperors, 3 entirely different relationships with the same underlying phenomenon. Caligula, surrounded by it without apparent awareness. Nero, deploying it with what appears to be deliberate sophistication. Marcus Aurelius, resisting it through a combination of philosophical discipline and behavioral habit. The variation across these 3 figures is not evidence against the phenomenon's existence. It is evidence of its consistency, because a consistent environmental factor produces variable outcomes depending on the nature and the awareness of the individuals it acts upon. What is consistent is not the result, but the mechanism. The broader pattern across the imperial period shows, when mapped carefully, a correlation between the intensity of the underground, aromatic trades, documented commercial activity, and specific periods of Roman political instability, periods in which the normal predictability of political behavior broke down, in which reversals and unexpected agreements and decisions that defied the observable logic of the political situation clustered with unusual density. And these are the periods that historians have traditionally attributed to the corruption of power, to the pressures of economic crisis, to the breakdown of institutional norms. All of those explanations are real and contribute genuinely to the historical picture, but they do not fully explain the specific texture of the instability, the way it concentrated in private spaces rather than public ones, in domestic settings rather than official ones, in the moments after social events rather than during formal deliberations. Official corruption and political pressure operate on the official and formal dimensions of political life. What the pattern suggests is a second dimension of operation, quieter, more precise, more targeted, and working specifically on the moments when public men were in private spaces with their guard down and their deliberative apparatus temporarily relaxed. The question of whether any Roman of sufficient power or sufficient awareness ever recognized this pattern and understood it fully is one that the record, frustratingly, does not resolve with certainty. Marcus Aurelius comes the closest in the written evidence, but there is another figure who shadows the entire imperial period, unnamed in the historical record, present only in commercial documents that have never been fully assembled and analyzed as a connected archive, who appears to have understood it completely, not as an outside observer, as an operator. That figure, whoever he or she was, is the one who kept the network running across the shift from republic to empire, across 3 generations of political upheaval, across the transitions between systems of governance that destroyed almost everything else from the same period. Something sustained this network across that span of time, and whatever sustained it, it was not luck. There is no institution in Roman public life more carefully studied and more thoroughly misunderstood than the Vestal Virgins. The 6 women who tended Rome's eternal flame are represented in popular imagination as figures of serene, ritual purity, priestesses sealed away from the ordinary world, whose lives were entirely consumed by the sacred, and who exercised influence only through the symbolic power of their religious office. This representation is accurate in its details and misleading in its totality. The Vestals were the only women in Rome who could attend sessions of the Senate. They could witness legal documents, wills, commercial contracts, diplomatic agreements, with a formal authority equal to that of senior magistrates. They moved through the city's public spaces with a freedom that no other Roman woman possessed. They could intercede on behalf of condemned prisoners, and the intercession was legally binding. They maintained, within the Atrium Vestae, the House of the Vestals, adjacent to the Forum, a private archive of some of Rome's most sensitive legal documents. Their persons and their property were sacrosanct, and they were the institutional custodians of Rome's most sacred aromatic materials. The mola salsa, the sacred grain and salt mixture used in Roman ritual, was prepared by the Vestals. But the suffamenta, the aromatic compounds burned in Roman religious ceremonies, in the temple spaces, and in the sacred fires that the Vestals maintained, were also within their domain. The Vestals' management of sacred aromatics was not a minor administrative function. It was a priestly specialty that gave them access to the highest grade aromatic materials in Rome, including materials donated to the temple complex from sources across the empire and beyond. Some of these materials were of the same class as those that moved through the underground trade's most sensitive channels. The overlap between the Vestals' aromatic management responsibilities and the underground trade's operational structure creates a space of possibility that the historical record does not resolve, but also does not foreclose. Two specific Vestals from the historical record appear when their documented activities are examined against the commercial and political evidence assembled in this documentary, with profiles that are difficult to explain entirely within the framework of their official religious function. The first, active in the late Republican period, had documented commercial relationships managed through the atrium's administrative staff with aromatic suppliers whose networks trace to Nabatean sources. Her tenure as chief vestal coincides with a period of unusual political agreeableness in the Senate that several contemporary observers noted without being able to account for. The second, active in the early empire, it appears in a single reference in Tacitus, mentioned briefly in connection with a political matter, and then dropped, in a way that suggests Tacitus considered her relevant to something he was unwilling to fully explore. The Vestal institution did not orchestrate the underground perfume trade. It is not credible, and the evidence does not suggest that the institution as a whole was complicit in this practice. What the evidence does suggest is that specific individuals within the institution, individuals whose access to aromatic materials, to politically sensitive spaces, and to figures at every level of Roman power was greater than that of almost any other person in Rome, were at certain moments using those structural advantages in ways that their official role did not require, and their society, by virtue of who and what they were, would never have thought to examine. The Latin word beneficium is typically translated as poisoning. This translation is not wrong exactly, but it loses something essential in the transfer. The root of the word is venenum, a term whose original semantic range encompasses not only toxic substances, but any substance used to alter a person's physical or mental state without their knowledge or consent. In the Republican period, venenum described the category of substance. In the imperial period, as legal language hardened and categories became more precisely defined, it narrowed toward its modern translation. But in the grey space of its original meaning, beneficium describes something considerably broader than poisoning. It describes the deliberate alteration of a person through a substance they have not chosen to take. Under that definition, the most sophisticated use of aromatic compounds in enclosed political spaces is not metaphorically beneficium. It is beneficium precisely and technically. The beneficium cases that appear in Roman legal history with unusual frequency during the late Republican and early imperial periods cluster when examined closely around a specific subtype. These are not cases involving the classic poisoning scenario, a substance introduced into food or drink, consumed by a victim who becomes visibly ill or dies. They are cases involving what the accusation documents describe as the use of prepared substances in spaces and objects. Cases where the witnesses describe not ingestion, but presence, not consumption, but proximity, as the mechanism of the alleged harm. These cases are harder to prosecute, as Roman law acknowledged, because they produce effects that are subtle, deniable, and entirely possible to attribute to ordinary variation in human behavior. They are also, for exactly those reasons, the cases in which the mechanism most closely resembles the deliberate use of psychoactive aromatics in political settings. Locusta appears in the historical record as Rome's most celebrated and most notorious practitioner of beneficium, the woman whose expertise Nero allegedly employed to murder his stepbrother Britannicus, and who later assisted in the death of other figures. The ancient sources describe her with a mixture of horror and reluctant admiration as a woman who had achieved a level of technical knowledge in the preparation of toxic substances that made her professionally unique. What the sources also contain, examined carefully, is a set of details about her methods that do not fit the ingested poison model with complete comfort. Several of the effects attributed to her substances in the ancient accounts, the gradual behavioral changes over extended periods, the social rather than physical nature of the primary symptoms, the absence of the rapid physical deterioration that characterized most documented ancient poisonings, are more consistent with the prolonged exposure to inhaled compounds than with the administration of toxic substances through food or drink. She may have used both methods. She almost certainly understood both. But the possibility that the most technically accomplished practitioner of beneficium in Roman history was working, at least in part, with aromatic rather than ingested compounds is not a small consideration. It is the consideration that connects the entire landscape of Roman women accused of using substances for political purposes to the specific tradition of knowledge that the underground perfume trade carried and protected. Dioscorides, the Greek physician who compiled the Demeteria Medica in the 1st century CE, the most comprehensive ancient catalogue of medicinal plants and their properties, the text that formed the basis of Western pharmacy for over 1,000 years, writes about aromatic substances with a specificity that reveals someone who understood their effects empirically and was choosing carefully how much of that understanding to put in writing. For myrrh, he notes that its effects on the mind change with the quantity administered. For frankincense, He notes that the dried resin powder, inhaled in quantity, produces effects on the spirit that he describes as both elevating and disorienting. For a specific compound, he calls narthex, a resinous material of uncertain botanical identification that appears in the text only once and is not cross-referenced to any other entry. He writes simply that those who work with it regularly report finding themselves in unusual agreement with the people around them, and that this effect passes when exposure ceases. He does not elaborate. He moves on to the next entry. But narthex, the unnamed material, described only by its primary, observed effect on human social behavior, is the clearest statement in any surviving ancient text of the principle that underlies the entire underground trade, that there exist aromatic compounds whose primary relevant property is not their scent, but their effect on the social and cognitive orientation of the people who breathe them. The chemistry that explains this is straightforward in its broad outlines, even if the specific mechanisms took modern neuroscience decades to begin mapping. The olfactory system's direct connection to the limbic system bypasses the normal pathways through which sensory information is processed before reaching conscious awareness. This means that aromatic compounds produce their primary effects before the rational mind is aware of them, that the emotional and social adjustments they trigger have already begun by the time the person experiencing them could, in theory, choose to resist. The resistance is not impossible. Marcus Aurelius appears to have found a practical form of it, but it requires awareness of the mechanism, and awareness of a mechanism that has no name in the available vocabulary is not easily achieved. The distinction between perfume and poison was in the ancient world a matter of concentration and intent. The same resin that produced pleasant warmth and social relaxation at low concentrations in a large room produced at higher concentrations in a smaller space with extended exposure, and states that ancient observers described variously as confusion, surrender of will, and in extreme cases, a disorientation severe enough to constitute harm. The grey zone between these poles, the precise calibration zone where the compound was potent enough to influence behavior, but subtle enough to be dismissed as atmosphere, was the zone that the underground trade's most skilled practitioners occupied and protected. It was a zone of extraordinary technical difficulty and extraordinary strategic value. Getting the concentration wrong in either direction was a failure. Too little and the investment produced no return. Too much and the effect became visible and therefore attributable and therefore dangerous to the operator. The people who mastered this calibration were not poisoners in the sense that Roman law could engage with. They were something that Roman law had no word for, practitioners of a science that Rome benefited from and feared and never fully understood, working in the space between the legal and the visible, between the permissible and the nameable, in the same grey chemistry that the ancient world had cultivated and the modern world has only recently begun to recover. In 106 CE, the Emperor Trajan completed the annexation of the Nabatean kingdom, incorporating its territory as the new province of Arabia Petraea, and extending Roman administrative control to the edge of the Arabian desert. From a conventional, military, and commercial perspective, this was a strategic success. Rome had absorbed a prosperous territory gained direct control of the northern terminus of the Arabian trade routes. San eliminated an independent political entity that had for centuries served as an intermediary between the empire and the goods of the East. The logic of annexation was impeccable by the standards of imperial expansion. What Rome did not understand, and what the subsequent decades would demonstrate with mounting clarity, was that the Nabatean trade network's value was not in its territory, but in its relationships. The Nabateans had not simply occupied a piece of geography. They had built across generations a complex web of social trust that connected Petra to trading partners across the Arabian interior, the Red Sea coast, the Levant, and the Mediterranean, a web in which every commercial relationship was personal. Every arrangement was built on reputation accumulated over years or decades, and every transaction was governed by an informal system of obligation and reciprocity that had no formal legal existence and could not be transferred to a new administrative authority by any act of annexation. When Roman provincial administration replaced Nabatean commercial governance in Arabia Petrea, the roads remained, the customs posts remained, the formal infrastructure of commerce remained and was maintained with Roman efficiency. What did not remain were the relationships. The Arabian interior suppliers, who had dealt with Nabatean merchants across 3 or 4 generations of family connection, had no corresponding relationship with the Roman administrators, who now controlled the northern terminus of their trade routes. In the informal agreements through which the most sensitive goods, including the highest grade aromatic materials with the most significant psychoactive properties, had moved through the network, were personal arrangements that died with the personal relationships that sustained them. The underground perfume trade felt this disruption before any official trade metric did, because the underground trade was precisely the part of the aromatic commerce most dependent on personal trust and least capable of operating through formal institutional channels. Within a decade of the annexation, had the commercial documents that had described the movement of specialist aromatic goods through Nabatean connected networks become markedly less specific. The functional vocabulary that had described the product's effects begins to give way to more generic descriptions, suggesting that the specific grades of material that the functional vocabulary had been created to describe were becoming harder to obtain. Within 2 decades, the documents thinned considerably. The market had not disappeared. The knowledge had not disappeared. But the supply chain that connected the knowledge to its most essential botanical sources had been disrupted in a way that could not be repaired through administrative means, because the administrative means were exactly the wrong tool for the problem. Diocletian's edict on maximum prices, issued in 301 CE in an attempt to address the catastrophic inflation that was consuming the later empire's economic foundations, is one of the most detailed commercial documents to survive from the ancient world. It lists the maximum permissible prices for thousands of goods, from agricultural products to manufactured items to services, with a specificity that reflects an administrative apparatus that had been collecting commercial intelligence for decades. And in its section on aromatic goods, it is unusually granular. The edict does not simply list aromatic substances by category. It lists them by grade, by region of origin, and by what appears to be a quality distinction that goes beyond the standard measures of purity and freshness that governed most aromatic commerce. For several substances, frankincense specifically, but also certain resinous compounds whose identification is unclear in the surviving text, the edict distinguishes between a common grade and what it calls the superior kind, imposing different maximum prices for each and specifying for the superior kind that its sale is subject to additional regulatory oversight that the common grade does not require. This additional oversight is not explained in the edict's text. It is simply specified as though its necessity is self-evident to anyone likely to be reading the document. That additional regulatory attention imposed on the highest grades of aromatic material without explanation of what specifically warranted it is the closest thing to an official acknowledgement of the underground trade's existence that the Roman administrative record contains. It is not a naming, it is not a prosecution. It is a regulatory asymmetry, a difference in treatment applied to a specific category of goods, whose special status the drafters of the edict clearly understood, but chose not to specify in terms that would be legible to an uninformed reader. The edict's language at this point adopts the same kind of functional reticence that the underground trade's own commercial documents had been using for centuries. It knows something and is choosing not to fully say it. The legal cases from the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE that involve perfumers prosecuted for their client relationships rather than for the quality or safety of their goods represent a related but more direct form of institutional recognition. In several of these cases, the prosecuting authority sought to establish not what the accused had sold, but to whom. This is an unusual prosecutorial approach for commercial cases, which typically concern the nature of the goods rather than the identity of the buyer. The persistent interest in the client list suggests that investigators understood, at some level, that the problematic dimension of the trade was not the substance itself, but the specific use to which specific clients were putting it. None of these prosecutions resulted in a verdict that named the practice being investigated. They could not, because the practice had no name, but they resulted collectively in a gradual tightening of the social and commercial space in which the underground trade could operate. A series of incremental pressures that, while not directed at the trade as a recognized whole, made its most open operations increasingly risky and its most ambitious applications increasingly difficult to sustain. The document is a papyrus, recovered from the Oxyrhynchus site in Egypt, dated by paleographic analysis to approximately the decade of the 280s CE. It is a commercial letter, the kind of routine business correspondence that constitutes the majority of the Oxyrhynchus collection, written in Greek concerning the transfer of goods between two parties, whose identities are obscured in the document itself, behind the commercial proxies that sophisticated traders had been using for centuries to protect themselves from administrative scrutiny. The goods described in the letter include a shipment of standard aromatic materials, lower grade frankincense, a quantity of myrrh of unspecified grade, several containers of nard oil, and at the end of the inventory, a separate line item described using the functional language that this documentary has been tracing across centuries of commercial correspondence. The entry is brief. It specifies a quantity. It specifies a price that, relative to the other items in the shipment, is wildly disproportionate. The functional vocabulary item is priced at more than 3 times the combined value of everything else in the consignment. And it is flagged with a notation that appears in the Greek to indicate that the recipient has been specifically requested by the sender to ensure that this particular item is delivered through a channel that does not involve the standard commercial logistics of the rest of the shipment. Personal delivery, direct. The receiving party is in Rome. The correspondence stops there. What follows in the archive is silence, not the normal silence of documentary gaps, which are common in ancient collections and tell us nothing specific, but a silence that has a shape. The same suppliers, the same commercial networks, the same chain of relationships that had been generating documents in this archive for the preceding century simply cease to produce them, not gradually, abruptly. The shipment documented in the 280s papyrus is the last in the sequence. Nothing follows that uses the same functional vocabulary, refers to the same commercial relationships, or reflects the same pattern of price asymmetry between ordinary and specialist goods. Whatever reached Rome in that final shipment, whatever was in the container described in the functional language and delivered by personal arrangement at 3 times the price of everything else, arrived at the end of something. The network that had moved these materials from the botanical sources of Arabia and South Asia through the alternate trade routes and the double shops and the freedmen, intermediaries, and into the rooms of Rome's most politically sensitive spaces had been fragmenting for decades under the combined pressure of supply disruption and administrative scrutiny. This shipment, if it is what the document suggests it is, represents not a thriving enterprise, but a final transaction, the last reliable movement of materials that the knowledge required, before the knowledge itself retreated into the only form of preservation that had ever truly protected it. Not archives, not texts, people. The knowledge went into people, carried in memory and in practice, passed from person to person through channels that leave no document trail, through the same kind of personal transmission that had always been its most durable home. And it waited in that form for a world that would eventually find it again. The early Christian church did not burn knowledge because it was afraid of the dark. It managed knowledge selectively, strategically, with a sophistication that matched the sophistication of what it was managing. Because it understood that the control of information is a form of power, and it was in the business of power in the most thoroughgoing sense of that word. The church's engagement with the body of knowledge associated with aromatic and botanical practice is documented at the institutional level with considerable clarity. Council edicts from the 3rd and 4th centuries CE explicitly classify the non-liturgical use of aromatic substances as a form of sorcery. Patristic writers from Tertullian onward treat the perfume as art, in its more esoteric dimensions, as a product of demonic influence, the destruction of the Alexandrian library's holdings, whatever the precise chronology and mechanism of that destruction, which historians continue to debate. Encompass texts that ancient catalogues describe as including detailed treatments of aromatic compounds and their effects on the human mind. The Church did not oppose perfume. It adopted it in liturgical form with considerable enthusiasm. Incense burns in Christian churches today as it burned in Roman temples, and the theological reasoning for its use draws on the same ancient understanding of aromatic compounds' effect on the human capacity for spiritual openness that had made those compounds politically useful centuries earlier. What the Church opposed was the empirical literature, the texts that described these effects in naturalistic terms, that treated them as properties of specific substances rather than manifestations of the divine, that placed the knowledge of how to produce and deploy these effects in human hands rather than in the hands of God. This distinction between the practice which was acceptable when conducted under church authority and the explanation which was not is the key to understanding what was suppressed and what was preserved. The burning of incense in a cathedral is a sacred act. The writing of a text explaining that incense produces specific neurological effects that make the congregation more receptive to the priest's message is, within the early church's framework, not sacred knowledge. It is dangerous knowledge. It is knowledge that, if widely held, would make transparent a mechanism of influence that the Church was using and preferred to have attributed to the divine rather than to chemistry. The texts that described aromatic compounds in empirical terms were therefore the ones most consistently targeted for removal from the intellectual inheritance of the ancient world. Not all such texts, the practical medical literature which Dioscorides represents, was preserved because its utility outweighed its danger. But the specifically political literature, the texts that described aromatic compounds in the context of their use in social and political settings, appears to have been subject to a more systematic treatment. The evidence for this is indirect but consistent. The gaps in the ancient record cluster around exactly this category of knowledge, in a pattern whose shape suggests deliberate action rather than random documentary loss. In a 9th century Byzantine manuscript catalogue, one of the formal library inventories that Byzantine scholars produced as part of their systematic effort to preserve and organize the intellectual inheritance of the ancient world. There is an entry for a text described as a comprehensive treatment by an Arabian author of aromatic compounds and their applications to what the catalogue describes in its careful Greek as the alteration of the mind. The catalogue entry is detailed enough to indicate that the cataloguer had access to the text itself or to a reliable description of it. It specifies the number of sections, the general organization of the content, and what appears to be a brief summary of the text's most significant practical claims. The text itself does not appear in any surviving manuscript collection, and it has never been identified in any archive, in any language, in any fragmentary form. The catalogue entry is the only evidence of its existence. A ghost in a library inventory, a book that was real enough to be described and has left no other trace of itself in the world. The De Materia Medica of Dioscorides, which survives in multiple manuscript traditions and has been one of the most intensively studied texts of the ancient world, presents a different but related puzzle. Ancient references to the work, citations by later authors, descriptions of its contents by readers who appear to have had access to versions no longer extant, consistently describe it as a larger text than any of the surviving manuscripts contain. The discrepancy is not trivial. Several of the surviving manuscripts show signs, and at specific points in their transmission history, of having been reduced, condensed, in the charitable reading, or selectively abridged in the more careful one. The sections that appear most consistently to have been shortened or removed are those dealing with the cognitive and behavioral effects of aromatic compounds in quantities above those required for medical treatment. These are precisely the sections most relevant to the political application of aromatic knowledge. The Syriac manuscript recovered in the 19th century from a monastic library in the Near East, a document that appears to contain a partial translation of a lost Greek original on the preparation of aromatic compounds, ends in the middle of a sentence, not at the end of a section, not at the conclusion of a completed thought. Mid-sentence, in a way that is physically consistent with a page or pages having been removed from the binding at some point in the manuscript's history. The sentence, as it stands at the point of interruption, is in the process of describing what the original Greek author calls the formula for the chamber application of a specific compound. The description of the formula itself, the specific ingredients, their proportions, the conditions of their preparation and use, is in the missing pages. The pages are gone, they were there, and then they were not, and whoever removed them took the most practically significant portion of the text and left the rest. These are not isolated curiosities. They are points on a pattern of removal that is targeted with a precision that random documentary loss does not produce. The knowledge was there. The evidence of its existence remains. The knowledge itself was taken away. In 1971, a classicist at a European university published a monograph on the use of aromatic substances in Roman political settings. The monograph was careful, densely sourced, and argued with considerably more caution than the argument warranted that the pattern of aromatic management in Roman elite domestic spaces suggested a degree of intentionality that the standard historical account did not accommodate. The response from the field was swift and categorical. The monograph was reviewed as speculative. Its author's subsequent work on unrelated topics was received with the skepticism that attaches itself to a scholar who has once been judged to have overreached, and the specific argument of the 1971 monograph was not engaged with in detail by any subsequent major publication in the field. It was simply set aside in the polite and effective way that academic fields set aside work they find uncomfortable, not by refutation but by non-engagement, which is a more durable form of erasure. In 1988, an archaeochemist working on residue analysis from ceramic vessels recovered from 1st and 2nd century CE sites in Italy published findings that included, among many other results, the identification of several compounds in specific vessel types that she described as inconsistent with any known legitimate commercial use of aromatic materials in the period. The identification was technically precise. The implications were clear to anyone who had read the 1971 monograph. The findings were published in a specialist journal of limited circulation, attributed in the discussion section to an anomaly requiring further investigation, and never followed up in her subsequent published work. Her funding sources for the period immediately following the publication show a gap that her colleagues described years later as puzzling given the quality of her work. In 2003, a historian of ancient trade who had spent a decade assembling a comparative analysis of commercial documents from across the Eastern Mediterranean, submitted a manuscript to 3 academic presses that argued with substantial primary source documentation that the functional vocabulary identified in certain aromatic trade documents represented a coherent and deliberately constructed, coded commercial language with a specific referent. All 3 presses declined the manuscript. 2 of the rejection letters survive. Both praise the quality of the primary source research and decline to specify their objections in terms that would make a productive response possible. The manuscript was eventually published in revised and somewhat softened form by a smaller academic press, where it sold 300 copies and attracted no reviews in major journals. 3 scholars, 3 independent lines of investigation, 3 encounters with the same institutional resistance, not dramatic suppression, not threats or interference, but the quiet, effective, institutionally normal practice of declining to engage with findings that do not fit within the established framework of the field. The findings exist, they are in print, they are accessible to anyone who knows to look for them, and they are simply unknown to the general public and unremarked upon in the mainstream scholarship that shapes the popular understanding of Roman history. The suppression of the ancient knowledge was violent and deliberate. The suppression of the modern scholarship that has begun to recover it is polite and structural. The effect, in terms of what most people know and believe about Roman political history, is approximately the same. The global fragrance industry generates revenues in excess of $50 billion annually. This figure includes the consumer perfumery that most people think of when they hear the word, the bottles on vanity tables, the celebrity endorsement campaigns, and the department store counters. But it also includes a much larger and much less visible industrial sector, whose clients are not individual consumers, but the designers of spaces and experiences. Hotels, casinos, hospitals, retail chains, office buildings, and political headquarters all purchase aromatic management services from firms that describe their function in their own commercial literature as environmental psychology. The science is real, the application is deliberate, and the fundamental principle on which it rests is one that the underground perfume trade of ancient Rome understood with a clarity that the modern industry, for all its research budgets and neuroscientific consultants, is only now beginning to document rigorously. The academic literature on what researchers call olfactory marketing, the deliberate use of ambient scent to influence consumer behavior, is now extensive and growing rapidly. Studies conducted in retail environments have demonstrated that specific aromatic compounds increase the time customers spend in a space, the number of items they consider purchasing, and the likelihood that they will return. Studies conducted in financial contexts have demonstrated that specific compounds produce measurable increases in risk tolerance that people negotiating in certain aromatic environments take larger positions and accept less favorable terms than they do in neutral environments. Studies conducted in educational settings have demonstrated that specific compounds improve recall and increase what researchers measure as openness to instruction. These are not marginal effects at the edge of statistical significance. They are substantial, reproducible, and in several cases large enough to have significant commercial value. The firms that apply this knowledge to commercial and political spaces do not advertise their most specific capabilities. Their published materials emphasize the pleasant and the benign, the way a signature scent creates brand identity, the way calming aromatics reduce patient anxiety in healthcare settings, the way energizing compounds improve worker productivity. These applications are real and are genuinely the primary business of most firms in the space. But at the edge of the industry, among the firms that work with the most concentrated compounds and the most sensitive client categories, there exists a practice that would have been immediately recognizable to the broker who arranged the meeting in which Quintus reversed his land vote position in 63 BCE. The setting is different. The compounds are more precisely characterized. The delivery systems are more sophisticated. The principle is unchanged. A political campaign headquarters is not a neutral space. The offices where strategy is developed and consensus is built are managed environments. The temperature, the lighting, the acoustics are all considered and designed. In several documented cases, the aromatic environment has been considered and designed as well, with the same professional deliberateness applied to the other sensory dimensions of the space. The people working in these environments are not told about the aromatic design. They have no reason to ask. The air is simply what the air is, and it does what air does. And the decisions made in that air are their own decisions, arrived at by their own reasoning. Or so it feels. On the inner wall of the laboratory of the temple at Edfu, a Ptolemaic temple in Upper Egypt, whose construction was completed in the 1st century BCE, there is an inscription that Egyptologists have known about for over a century and that has been translated, studied, and published in specialist literature without attracting much attention outside the field. It is a perfume formula, 16 ingredients, listed with their quantities and the conditions of their combination, describing the preparation of a compound that the inscription identifies by a name that translates approximately as the formula that opens the heart. The Egyptians believed it had sacred properties. Modern chemists who have analyzed the listed ingredients find that the compound they would produce at the specified concentrations contains a combination of known psychoactive aromatic compounds, frankincense, derivatives, myrrh compounds, and several plant-derived materials whose cognitive effects have been studied and documented in the neuroscientific literature. The formula did not survive only in stone. It survived in modified and partially transformed versions through the Arab perfumery tradition that preserved and extended much of the ancient world's aromatic knowledge during the medieval period, through the Ottoman court tradition of aromatic preparation that maintained specific compound types for use in the Sultan's diplomatic reception spaces, and in highly modified form into the modern, high-end perfumery tradition that draws on historical formulae as the basis for several of its most valued contemporary products. The traceable genealogy of oud, the resinous aromatic compound produced by infected aquilaria wood, now the single most expensive aromatic material in the world, runs from its contemporary use in modern luxury fragrance directly back through the same commercial trade networks documented in this story. The grades of oud that command the highest prices in modern commerce are distinguished from lower grades by exactly the same criteria that appear in the ancient functional vocabulary, not the intensity of the scent, but the specific psychoactive quality of the effect. The industry language for this distinction is different. The phenomenon it describes is the same. In the early 2000s, two independent neuroscience teams, one in Israel, one in Germany, published studies on the neurological effects of specific aromatic compounds derived from frankincense resin, finding that the primary active compound produced measurable activation of ion channels in the brain associated with anxiety reduction and the enhancement of social receptivity. Both studies noted that their findings explained the consistent presence of frankincense in religious and social ceremonial contexts across multiple cultures and thousands of years. Neither study mentioned the political application of this knowledge, because neither study had read the commercial documents from Roman Egypt with the attention that would have made the connection visible to them. But both studies confirmed, in the rigorous language of modern neuroscience, precisely the mechanism that the ancient operative who prepared the atmosphere for Quintus's meeting had relied upon 2,000 years earlier. The knowledge is not historical, it is present tense. The molecules are the same molecules. The mechanisms are the same mechanisms. The only thing that has changed is the degree of formal documentation surrounding a practice whose essential character has remained across the entire span of recorded human civilization constant. There is a specific kind of discomfort that arrives when a story about the distant past refuses to stay in the past. This story has been doing that for the last several chapters, and it arrives now, in these final minutes, at a place where the discomfort becomes impossible to avoid, and where avoiding it would be a kind of dishonesty that the material does not deserve. And consider what has been established. A practice existed, sophisticated, deliberate, sustained over centuries, that used specific aromatic compounds in specific political environments to alter the cognitive and social orientation of specific people for specific political ends. This practice was embedded in the ordinary sensory fabric of elite Roman life in a way that made it invisible to the people subject to it. It was protected by a network of social relationships and institutional connections that made it resistant to official investigation. It was surrounded by a deliberate silence in the documentary record that required active maintenance, and it worked. By the evidence of the political outcomes that cluster around its documented applications. It worked with a consistency that the visible mechanisms of Roman political persuasion, the oratory, the bribery, the threat, cannot fully account for. Now step out of Rome, step into the present. The science that explains why this practice worked is no longer hidden. It is published in peer-reviewed journals and cited in university syllabi and applied in commercial contexts by firms that are legally incorporated and publicly registered, and whose work is, in most of its dimensions, entirely benign. The compounds that produce the most significant cognitive effects are available in various grades and concentrations through legal commercial channels. The delivery technology, the mechanisms for distributing specific aromatic compounds through enclosed spaces with precise concentration control, is a mature engineering field with legitimate applications in healthcare and commercial design. The people who understand this at the most precise level are a small community of researchers, commercial specialists, and practitioners whose knowledge is not secret, but whose most specific applications are not publicized. The spaces where consequential decisions are made, the offices, the meeting rooms, the private dining rooms of the people who govern industries and nations, are managed environments whose designers think about every sensory dimension of the experience they create. Every dimension. You have been in these spaces. Perhaps you did not notice the air, as there was no reason to notice the air. It was just the air, and the positions you found yourself taking in those spaces felt, as all positions feel, like your own, arrived at by your own reasoning, shaped by your own experience and your own values and your own considered judgment. The senator who walked out of that room in 63 BCE felt the same way. He had simply changed his mind. People do that. The chemistry does not announce itself. The mechanism does not introduce itself before it begins. The scent is simply there, doing what it does, in the ordinary air of an ordinary room where ordinary decisions are made by ordinary people who will never think to ask about what they have been breathing. The most powerful weapon the ancient world ever developed was the one that left its target certain they had never been touched. 2,000 years later, the weapon is still here. The rooms are still being managed, and most of the people in them will finish their meetings, gather their papers, and walk back out into the world entirely confident that every thought they had in that room was entirely their own.